Well, thanks again for logging on to CCC Online. I'm Ryan and I'm the student minister here at CCC. There was a recent study that specifically focused on the health and well-being of teenagers and adolescents in America. And since I work with students here at CCC, I was eager to see what they found. And I have to say, the results were staggering. According to this new data, in 2021, more than a third, 37% of high school students reported they experienced poor mental health during the past 2 years. And 44% reported they persistently felt sad or hopeless. Let me say that again. 44% of high school students reported feeling persistently sad or hopeless. And honestly, I wasn't shocked. It just confirmed what I've begun to see over the past few years. Through conversations with students and parents and small group leaders here at CCC, I've heard more and more stories about the hopelessness and despair the students have been experiencing. And it's not just students. If there was to be a similar study done with adults, I'm sure the results would be pretty much the same. Because here's the deal. Chances are, at one time or another, many of us, if not all of us, will find ourselves in seasons where it feels like hope is just out of reach, where things seem just too heavy or too tiring or too much to handle. And in the midst of those dark seasons, we can think that we're the only ones. We can believe that this sense of despair and hopelessness, that it's new with us. But hopelessness, it is not new. It's not something that just reared its ugly head in the past couple years. It's been a problem from the very beginning. Throughout all of time, throughout history, people have encountered a sense of hopelessness for one reason or another. Even in the Bible, Jesus tells us, he warns us of this when he says, in this world, you will have trouble. So it shouldn't be a surprise when we find ourselves in those moments. Psalm 77, it has a lot to teach us, specifically in the area of hopelessness. It's written by a guy named Asaph. Now, we don't know much about him. In fact, he's only mentioned a few times in the Bible. Just a few books earlier in the Bible, we read that he appointed some of the Levites to minister before the ark of the Lord, to extol, to thank, and to praise the Lord, the God of Israel. Asaph was the chief. They were to play the lyres and the harps. Asaph was to sound the cymbals. So Asaph's job was basically as a worship leader, a choir director. And we don't know much else about him, but what we do get, we find here in Psalm 77. So this morning, we are going to the school of Asaph. If someone asks you later today what church was about, you can tell them you went to the school of Asaph. So let's check out what he writes. I cried out to God for help. I cried out to God to hear me. When I was in distress, I sought the Lord. At night, I stretched out my untiring hands, and I would not be comforted. I remembered you, God, and I groaned. I meditated, and my spirit grew faint. You kept my eyes from closing. I was too troubled to speak. I thought about the former days, the years of long ago. I remembered my songs in the night. Now, we don't know exactly what darkness or hopelessness Asaph was facing. He never tells us what is happening or has happened in his life. But I think we may be able to identify with how he's feeling. What he's basically saying is, God, don't you hear me? I can't handle this on my own. I've been crying out to you nonstop. I've tried asking you for help and nothing changes. And now, on top of everything, I can't even sleep. Maybe you've been there before. Maybe you found yourself in a season where you are crying out to God. And it can be for a variety of reasons. And it just reaches a point where everything piles up and it becomes too much and all you can do is cry. And on top of all of it, he can't even sleep. I mean, how many of you have found yourself in the middle of a sleepless night, just laying in bed, eyes wide open, and you can't sleep? You can't turn your brain off. You run from one scenario to another. The fear, the despair, it just becomes crippling. It moves from an emotional response to a physical response. It literally keeps you from the sleep that you so desperately need. So you lay in bed and you think. You worry. You worry about your grades. You can't stop thinking about your health or your job. You lay there wide awake and you can't stop thinking about that broken relationship or your finances or your family. And it is exhausting, physically and emotionally. And if you've been there, you know this. You get irritable. You're not the person you want to be. You don't like how you feel, who you are. See, the sense we get is that whatever Asaph is going through, It's not some sudden tragedy, but rather whatever he's been feeling, it's been hanging around for a while. For him, this is a darkness that will not lift. And then it's at that moment that Asaph, he lets it rip. He lets it all out. He doesn't hold anything back. Up until this point, he's just sharing his frustrations, letting his exhaustion out. The crying, the lack of sleep, it's caught up with him. And he gets real with God. He says those things that many of us have said in moments like this. Will the Lord reject forever? Will he never show his favor again? Has his unfailing love vanished forever? Has his promise failed for all time? Has God forgotten to be merciful? Has he, in anger, withheld his compassion? Maybe you've said it this way. Why is God letting this happen? Why won't God heal this person? Why won't he fix this friendship? Why is he letting me down? God, I don't deserve this. God, where are you? See, it's at that moment. It's with these questions that Asaph, he is completely honest with God. His despair, it's too much. And it's the only thing he can do. How many of us could write those 9 verses? How many of us could copy down what Asaph wrote and sign our own name to it for one time or another in our life? I know I could. For multiple times, in fact. There have been plenty of times in my life where, because of the circumstances that I was facing, that I felt completely and utterly alone, that maybe even God had abandoned me. Maybe right now, that's where you find yourself. That due to whatever is happening in your life, you feel like God has completely abandoned you, that he is nowhere to be found, and it doesn't make sense. Maybe it just doesn't feel fair. Like at one time you felt God's presence, and now you don't. There were seasons where you felt close to God, but now he seems distant or even missing altogether. Well, during my time here at CCC, I've sat across from multiple families and from students who were in their own season of despair. I remember early on, a high school guy telling me his parents were getting a divorce, and I could just see the weight of the situation on his face. He had bags under his eyes, and his face had lost some of the color. He looked tired. And not just I was up late doing homework or playing video games tired, but deep in my soul, I am weary kind of tired. His difficult circumstances, they weren't his fault. The issues his folks were having laid squarely on their own shoulders, and yet he felt this terrible burden as though their impending divorce was his responsibility to stop, and he was hopeless. The words he used to describe the situation, what he was feeling, was basically a modern version of these first 9 verses. He himself, he could have been Asaph. In that moment, God seemed nowhere to be found. For him, God seemed absent when he needed him most. And that is exactly where we find Asaph. Remember, we don't know what he's facing. I'm sure we can imagine. We could all give Asaph's words a personal story. It could have been due to an illness. It could have been a broken dream. It could have been any number of things. And if the song ended there, man, that would be tough. If the song ended there, we'd all just kind of give a nod to Asaph and say, I feel your pain, but what can you do? But luckily for us, Asaph doesn't stop writing. And kind of the pivot point, the hinge point for his song, the point where in the song where the chorus builds and the key changes is verse 10. Then I thought, to this I will appear. The years when the Most High stretched out his right hand. Everything changes with those first 3 words. Then I thought. What's Asaph doing? He's thinking differently. Asaph doesn't say, then my circumstances changed. He doesn't say, whatever was wrong, it got better. He says, then I thought. Then my thinking changed. I thought differently. But he just doesn't stop there. He continues. I will remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I will remember your miracles of long ago. I will consider all your works and meditate on all your mighty deeds. Your ways, God, are holy. What God is as great as our God? You are the God who performs miracles. You display your power among the peoples. With your mighty arm, you redeemed your people, the descendants of Jacob and Joseph. The waters saw you, God. The waters saw you and they writhed. The very depths were convulsed. The clouds poured down water. The heavens resounded with thunder. Your arrows flashed back and forth. Your thunder was heard in the whirlwind. Your lightning lit up the world. The earth trembled and quaked. Your path led the sea, your way through the mighty waters, though your footprints were not seen. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. You see, in spite of whatever was currently happening in his life, Asaph makes an intentional decision to stop thinking about whatever was happening right in front of him and to remember. This is so important. We don't want to miss this. He specifically says he will remember the deeds of the Lord. He will remember God's miracles of long ago. He is not allowing his current circumstance to shape who God is. He is not allowing what's currently happening in his life to shape what he believes about God. And the reality is that is an easy thing to do. It is easy to find ourselves persistently feeling hopelessness and despair and then believing that God must be to blame, that God must be absent, that God has forgotten about us. But Asaph, he is choosing to remember what he knows to be true about God, what God has done. He is saying, God, I know I don't see you right now. I know things may be dark, but you are bigger. He specifically goes back and reminds himself of how God stepped into this world and interacted in history. He reminds himself that God is the same God who split the Red Sea so that Moses could lead the Israelites through water and out of slavery to freedom. For Asaph, in those first 9 verses, he was looking at things incorrectly. His perspective was skewed. He had a small view of God and a big view of his circumstances. When he looked at his life, when he looked at what he was facing, it was bigger than his view of God. And when that is true, when that is our perspective, hopelessness will prevail. Perspective, it can be a powerful thing. There's a children's book written some years ago. You may have heard of it. It's called Zoom. It's a playful book, but it communicates a really important principle. The author starts out showing us a picture. Actually, here's one. So what do you think this is a picture of? Well, then you turn the page and it zooms out and you see this. And you realize some things were missing in the first picture that didn't give you all the details. So now what do you think it's a picture of? And then you turn the page. And now what do you think it is? And you turn the page again and you see a little bit more. And then one more page and you see even more. You see, it's a playful book, but it helps us to see that we have a limited perspective. And it's our limited perspective that keeps us from seeing what is really there. We end up missing out on other things that are happening altogether because we are stuck at looking at what is right in front of us. We can't see the forest for the trees. In those moments of darkness and despair, we get stuck in a mode of only look at things that way. It turns out to be a kind of hopelessness and despair tunnel vision. Everything we see is tainted by our current situation and our current circumstances. But remember, today, we are at the school of Asaph. So we need to begin to think differently, change our perspective to make God bigger than what we are facing. So how do we do it? What do we do when we find ourselves in those seasons when everything piles up? Well, first, you might just need to cry out. That might just be the first thing you need to do. Up until this point, you might have been carrying this hopelessness all alone. You may have been trying the suck it up method. Just crossing your fingers that maybe, just maybe, you can find the strength somewhere on the inside to pull yourself out of the darkness that you're living in. Well, as a kid growing up in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, I had this unreasonable fear of quicksand. Maybe it was because of movies or TV shows that I had watched. But as I grew up, throughout most of my childhood, I assumed quicksand was a much bigger problem than it actually turned out to be. I feel like old Saturday morning cartoons wanted us to believe that we could run into a patch of quicksand around every corner. And the reality is, quicksand is real, but just very rare. But perchance, I did run into a patch of quicksand, which was not too prevalent in Lancaster County. We all know the worst thing to do is to struggle. The more you freak out and struggle, the more dangerous it gets. You can't just muster up the strength to pull yourself out of the quicksand on your own. They recommend that you calm down and you lean back and you cry out for help. And hopefully someone will come and find you and help you out. When you find yourself feeling hopelessness and despair, ask yourself if you have cried out to God. This is not the only psalm that begins this way. We read in Psalm 34, the righteous cry out and the Lord hears them and he delivers them from their troubles. Psalm 141 says, O Lord, I cry out to you. Come quickly. Open your ears to me when I cry out to you. Psalm 130 says, out of the depths I cry out to you, O Lord. Lord, hear my voice. Psalm 18 says, in my distress I called to the Lord. I cried to my God for help. Crying out, it is not weakness. Crying out is the first step in admitting that we cannot do this on our own. It is telling God that we are utterly and completely reliant on him. And maybe you've been crying out, maybe for a long time, and you are beginning to feel like God is just not hearing you. That as much as you pray and as much as you cry, you cannot seem to find your way out of the darkness. This too is where we can learn from Asaph. We can be completely honest with God. When Asaph reached that point that he feels like God has abandoned him, left him completely alone, he just doesn't hold those feelings deep inside and use them to turn his back on God. Remember, he lets it rip. He tells God exactly how he is feeling. And this kind of being honest with God, it doesn't feel like the sort of thing you'd hear from church. It doesn't feel like the Sunday school answer. But the Bible is full of this as well. There is a whole book in the Bible called Lamentations, all about crying out and being brutally honest with God. Being honest with how we feel is a way to express our faith. By not hiding away how we really feel, we are trusting God with our hardest parts. It's saying, God, I trust you enough to be completely honest, and I know it's going to be okay. The more honest we are, the more room we give God to work in and through us. And God, he can handle our honesty. Gosh, if anyone can take our honesty, it is God. Nothing we will say is going to hurt, shock, or offend him. And sometimes we're afraid to cry out and get honest with God because we think it somehow communicates a weakness about us. We tell ourselves that a good Christian, a good follower of Jesus would not feel this, that somehow our faith has become cheap or not as real. And it is the exact opposite. Our honesty with God communicates a deep and mature faith. And again, many of us have been right here. Many of us have naturally found these first two steps on our own, but we kind of stall out. We're so worn out, so tired, so beat up that we stall out in the crying and the honesty, but we cannot just live here. The temptation is to live here, to just get angry and jaded and turn our back on God. And the danger is, if it's not addressed, if we live in this moment, it can easily turn to bitterness. We get angry. But remember, today, we're going to the school of Asaph, and Asaph doesn't stop here. And just like Asaph, we need our own verse 10 pivot point. We need to remember. And that's what he did. He remembered what God had done in the past. I went to college in East Tennessee at Milligan University. And down in that part of the country, there is so much to do outdoors. You could hike or fish or camp, even go caving. And maybe you've been caving before. I'm not talking about Indian Oko caverns with a tour guide, but real caving. I had the opportunity to do it a few times. I remember one specific trip, a few of us headed deep into this cave with only our headlamps. A good ways into the cave, we came to a spot that seemed to be the end of the cave. And my friend Brad, who was leading us, he pointed to a small hole in the floor of the cave, and he said, that is the birth canal, and that is where we're going. And one by one, we slowly lowered ourselves feet first into the birth canal. And when it was my turn, I quickly learned how it earned its name. I don't remember being born per se, but I'm assuming it felt a bit like this. There was just enough space for your body to fit with your arms at your side, and you had to wiggle and shimmy your body straight down. You could feel the walls of the caves press tighter and tighter against you. Anyone starting to panic a little bit? Well, at some point the cave would give birth and pop you out into this dark, wide open cavern. And we all stood there for a moment with our headlamps on, kind of looking around and being in awe of what we had just experienced. But then Brad told us to turn our lamps off. And in that moment, I experienced darkness for the very first time in my life. There was no city lights, no glow of a screen in the background. I couldn't even see my hand in front of my face. And quickly, this sense of panic took over. I couldn't see where to go. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to cry out and to yell. I wanted to get completely honest with Brad and tell him how angry I was for leading us down this birth canal into this darkness. But then I stopped and I slowed down and I began to remember. I remembered what the room looked like before the lights turned out. I can remember seeing the way out. I remembered that Brad had been here before, that he knew the way in and he knew the way out. Sometimes in our darkness, in the hopelessness, it is hard to remember. It's hard to even see what is right in front of you. Everything else may seem too big or too heavy or too scary. And in those moments, it is difficult to remember what God has done. For some of you, journaling is a helpful tool. I know for me, it can be. And if it is for you, you can use this to keep an account of what God is up to in your life. To jot down prayers that he's answered. To keep track of the times of your life when you've seen God show up. Moments when you have been in awe of God. So in those dark seasons, you can look back and remember who God has been to you in the past. If God has shown up for you in the past, what makes you think he's going to stop now? What makes you think that the same God who created the heavens and the earth, the same God that parted the Red Sea, the same God that calmed storms and healed the sick and gave sight to the blind, won't do the same for you? And that is why it's so important that we gather here, that we make it a priority to be here each week when we open the Bible and when we sing together and we celebrate communion. It is all about remembering. It's part of how we first learn about what God has done and how we remember. And that is exactly what Asaph does. Asaph begins to remember the works of God. He begins to remember what he knows to be true about God. Well, as I said earlier, I've sat across from many families in some of their most hopeless hours and darkest nights. You might remember we did a dollar offering for the Bailey family just a few weeks ago, and their son Tyler was diagnosed with cardiomyopathy and very quickly required a heart transplant. In the weeks leading up to the transplant, there were lots of hard conversations. There were days and nights that felt hopeless and full of despair. But I can remember sitting with them in the waiting room as we waited for the doctor to let us know how that transplant went. There was still plenty that could have gone wrong in that moment. The circumstances had not yet changed, but I will never forget what Tyler's mom said. As she was talking about the difficulty, the pain of the past few months, she began talking about the blessings they had seen. She began to remember who God had been and began to see him at work in their current circumstances. You see, Tyler's mom, she began to do something that Asaph did. There was a verse 10 pivot point. She went from a view that said, my current circumstance is bigger than my God, to a perspective that said, my God is bigger, to a perspective that said, I know my God is bigger than what I am currently facing. And maybe today you need a verse 10 pivot point. You see, we need a change of perspective. I remember Dave telling a story once. It was about a young boy sitting on the floor at his grandmother's feet. And as he sits and plays, she's busy sewing and knitting away. And as he looks up, all he sees is this tangled mess of strings, these knots and loose ends, and it doesn't make any sense. Finally, he asks her, Grandma, what are you working on? What are you making? It's just a bunch of strings. Well, she reaches down and she scoops them up and she places them on her lap. And she slowly turns that tangled mess of strings around and she reveals to him a beautiful tapestry, this beautiful work of art. And from his perspective, from where he sat on the floor at her feet, it didn't make any sense. With his limited view, he was totally missing on what was right there. His perspective had to change. He had to see things from her viewpoint. This might be the most difficult step because it is a choice. It is looking around and seeing that your current circumstances, they have not yet changed and knowing they might not, and then choosing to look at the world differently, choosing to look at things the way God does, choosing to say that my God is bigger than what I am currently facing. I once heard circumstances defined as the things you see when you get your eyes off God. If we look at God through our circumstances, if we look at God through the darkness of our current situation, he will seem small and very far away. But if we change our perspective, if we look at what's happening through God's perspective, we will realize that he is greater than any circumstance we could ever face. In these 20 verses in Psalm 77, we see Asaph have a complete change of perspective. He realizes, because of what he knows to be true about God, that God is bigger than whatever he is currently facing. Look at what Paul writes in Hebrews. Let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinful men, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart.